A powerful CEO disguises himself as a broke factory worker to see how his employees truly behave. Most ignore him, some mock him, and a few show kindness. But when the truth comes out, the entire company is shaken. Loyalty, greed, and betrayal are all revealed. He arrived at the factory on a cold Monday morning, dressed in worn-out boots and a faded jacket. His hands carried the marks of hard work, even though he hadn't lifted a single box in years. No one paid him much attention when he walked through those rusted gates. To them, he was just another desperate worker looking for a paycheck. But they had no idea who he really was. From the very first day, he blended in like he had been one of them his whole life. The factory floor was filled with noise, machines grinding, voices shouting, orders being barked by supervisors. The air smelled of metal and dust, and the workers moved like shadows, tired, hopeless, yet clinging to their jobs. He looked no different from them, his clothes stained, his face humble, his pockets nearly empty. And that's exactly how he wanted it. The man who now appeared as nothing more than a poor worker was, in truth, the owner of everything around them. He was the CEO who had built this company from nothing, the man whose decisions shaped the future of everyone inside those walls. But after years of hearing whispers that his employees were mistreated, that managers grew arrogant, and that loyalty was fading, he had decided to see the truth with his own eyes. He wanted to know, were his people honest when no one was watching? Would they still treat a worker with dignity, even if he seemed worthless? The answer revealed itself faster than he expected. On his very first break, he sat alone with a paper cup of weak coffee. Workers walked past him, some not even glancing in his direction. A group at the far table laughed loudly, whispering to each other as their eyes darted toward him. He caught the word beggar tossed into their conversation, followed by smirks. He lowered his eyes, hiding the spark of anger in his chest. They didn't know the truth, and that was exactly the point. Yet not everyone looked at him with contempt. A young woman, her hands rough from labor, walked over quietly and offered him half of her sandwich. She didn't say much, just smiled and said, "You look like you could use it." That small act struck him deeply. He thanked her, taking the sandwich though he didn't need it, because it told him something important. Even in a place drowning with pride and indifference, kindness still survived. The days turned into weeks, and his disguise became routine. Every morning, he reported to the factory floor, blending in among grease-stained uniforms and tired faces. He listened closely to how supervisors barked orders, how certain managers treated workers as if they were disposable. One particular supervisor, a man named Richard, became the center of his attention. Richard often yelled at the workers, mocking them in front of others, cutting corners to meet quotas, and threatening anyone who questioned him. But what disturbed the undercover CEO most wasn't Richard's cruelty. It was the silence of those around him. The workers kept their heads down, afraid to speak, because they needed the job. Fear had silenced their voices. And the CEO, disguised as one of them, felt that silence like a dagger. One Friday evening, as the shifts ended, the CEO noticed something he couldn't ignore. A group of workers were ordered to stay late, unpaid, cleaning up a spill that wasn't their fault. Richard stood there with folded arms, smirking as he told them, "If you don't like it, leave. There's always someone else desperate enough to take your place." The words burned into his memory. That night, the CEO sat alone in his small rented apartment, staring at the ceiling. He had chosen this disguise to learn the truth, and now the truth was unavoidable. The company he had built was no longer the family he once dreamed of. It had turned into a place where fear and disrespect ruled, where dignity was lost. And while some employees showed kindness, far too many had grown cold, shaped by a toxic system. But he wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet.
No.
The time had to be perfect. The following Monday, he decided to test his employees in a way they would never forget. He arrived on the floor with heavy boxes stacked on a dolly, his back bent under the weight. He intentionally struggled, his knees buckling slightly as he moved across the factory floor. He wanted to see who would step forward, who would help the broke worker when no one else was watching. The response was telling. A few workers laughed, nudging each other as he wobbled. Richard, the supervisor, smirked from a distance, not lifting a finger. Only two people moved forward. One was the same young woman who had shared her sandwich weeks earlier, and the other was an older man with gray hair, who quietly took the heavier end of the box without saying a word. That moment lit a fire in him. These two strangers, who knew nothing of his real power, had revealed their character without hesitation. And soon, he promised himself, the world would see the difference between those who mocked and those who cared. Still, he waited. Patience was his greatest weapon. He wanted the arrogance of the unkind to climb to its peak, so when the truth finally shattered their illusions, it would strike harder than lightning. And in the days that followed, arrogance rose higher than ever. Richard grew bolder, mocking him openly, even in front of others. "You'll be lucky to last another week here," he sneered one morning, shoving a stack of dirty work onto his table. "People like you never survive in this place." The workers around them chuckled, some whispering, some looking away to avoid being dragged into the scene. But the undercover CEO only nodded, hiding his true thoughts. Inside, he repeated the words to himself. "People like you never survive in this place." He knew that soon, it wouldn't be him struggling to survive. It would be Richard and everyone else who had chosen arrogance over dignity. And as the factory clock ticked toward another ending shift, the CEO decided the time was approaching. The masks people wore were about to be torn away. The following week began with an unusual tension in the air. Rumors spread across the factory floor that the owner himself would soon be visiting. The workers whispered in hushed voices, some nervous, some excited, others fearful that their careless words or lazy habits might be exposed. Yet no one suspected that the very man they thought of as a broke, struggling worker had been among them all along, quietly watching, quietly listening. Every interaction became heavier with meaning. The young woman who had shared her sandwich continued her small acts of kindness, checking if he was managing his workload, offering help without expecting anything in return. The older man, too, steady and silent, remained supportive. But the majority still looked at him with disdain. They assumed he was weak, someone beneath them, a man who had to obey without question because he had no choice. Richard, the supervisor, only grew more ruthless. He barked orders with even more arrogance, as if he could sense no limits to his power. He mocked the undercover CEO in front of everyone, calling him dead weight and warning others not to end up like him. "See this guy?" Richard shouted one afternoon, his voice echoing over the machines. "This is what failure looks like. No drive, no future, just another broken man waiting to be tossed aside." Laughter followed. The CEO stood silently, absorbing the words. His jaw tightened, but he showed no reaction. For years, he had been praised, celebrated, and admired as a powerful leader in suits and polished shoes. Yet in this disguise, stripped of status, he saw the raw truth of people's hearts. He saw cruelty without restraint. And he knew that when the truth surfaced, it would be unforgettable. Days later, the factory was thrown into chaos. A critical machine broke down, halting production and threatening to cost the company thousands. Workers scrambled to fix the issue, but no one could figure out the problem. Richard, instead of guiding, shouted and cursed, blaming everyone around him. Fear spread like wildfire. Who would take responsibility for the failure? The undercover CEO, quietly observing, knew the answer. He had studied this very machine years ago, back when the company was still small, back when he himself had worked side by side with technicians. He stepped forward, his hands steady, his movements sure. Workers stared in confusion as the broke man crouched down and adjusted the system with precision. Within minutes, the machine roared back to life, the deafening silence replaced by the rhythm of production. For a moment, there was stunned silence. The same people who had mocked him days before now stared in disbelief. How did this poor worker know so much? How had he solved a problem that even trained staff had failed to fix? Richard, red with embarrassment, forced a laugh and dismissed it. "Beginner's luck," he sneered. But deep down, fear flickered in his eyes. That night, Word of the incident spread across the factory like a storm. Workers whispered about the strange man who looked broke yet carried knowledge far beyond them. Suspicion began to build. Who was he really? Where had he come from? But no one dared to ask directly, not yet. The CEO knew the moment was approaching. He could feel the tension, the shifting energy of the workplace. His disguise was no longer just about seeing the truth. It was about preparing the stage for a revelation that would forever alter how these people saw him and themselves. The next morning, Richard's arrogance reached new heights. Furious that his authority had been undermined, he decided to humiliate the undercover CEO in front of everyone. He piled extra tasks onto him, more than one man could handle, deliberately setting him up to fail. He barked, "Let's see if the hero from yesterday can actually pull his weight today." The room filled with nervous laughter. The CEO accepted the challenge without a word. Hour after hour, he carried heavy loads, wiped sweat from his brow, and endured the mocking comments. His body ached, but he pushed forward, each step building toward the moment of truth. The young woman and the older man tried to help him, but Richard stopped them with threats of punishment. He wanted to watch this broke man collapse. By the end of the shift, exhausted and dripping with sweat, the undercover CEO stood tall. He had completed every task. The factory floor fell silent. No one expected him to last. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted, though few realized it yet. Later that evening, the CEO sat outside, the cool night air brushing against his face. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the empire he had built, the trust he had placed in his managers, the betrayal he had uncovered. He thought of his father, who had once told him, "A man's true character is revealed not by how he treats the powerful, but how he treats those he believes are powerless." Now he had seen exactly that. The truth was undeniable. The time had come. The masquerade could not continue forever. His people needed to know who he really was. But before that, he wanted one final test. One last chance for those who had mocked him to show if they were capable of change, or if their arrogance had sunk too deep to be saved. The following day, he arrived earlier than usual. The factory gates creaked open, and he walked in with a quiet determination. Whispers followed him again, but this time they were different, quieter, more uncertain. The incident with the broken machine had left a mark on their minds. As the morning progressed, he intentionally placed himself in situations that required cooperation. He asked for small favors, help with lifting boxes, assistance with equipment. Some ignored him, brushing him aside as usual. Richard, of course, refused with open mockery. But the young woman and the older man responded without hesitation, just as they always had. Their actions confirmed what he already knew. Kindness was not born of recognition, but of character. The factory owner, still in disguise, watched the workers around him with sharp eyes. Every laugh, every insult, every act of kindness or cruelty was a note in the final symphony he was composing. Soon, the curtain would rise, and everyone would see the truth. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the factory floor, the undercover CEO felt the weight of his decision settle in his chest. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, those who mocked would face the truth they never imagined. And those who showed kindness would be lifted higher than they ever dreamed. The stage was set. The players had revealed themselves. And the man they thought was nothing would soon show them that he was everything. The morning of the reveal began like any other, but the man who had lived as a broke worker for weeks carried himself differently that day. His boots were still worn, his jacket still faded, but there was an unshakable strength in his stride. The same workers who once mocked him glanced uneasily as he entered the factory. They couldn't explain why, but something about him felt changed, more commanding, more certain. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Some wondered if he had been a mechanic in another life. Others speculated he had connections higher up. But no one imagined the truth. To them, he was still just a poor man clinging to a job. And that assumption would soon shatter like glass. That day, the factory floor was unusually tense. The regional managers had arrived, sharp suits and polished shoes clicking across the concrete. Richard, the arrogant supervisor, scurried to impress them, barking orders louder than ever. He believed this was his moment to shine. Standing tall, he looked at the undercover CEO with his usual sneer and muttered, "This will be the day you finally get tossed out." The undercover CEO said nothing. He simply went about his work, stacking, lifting, listening, while the managers observed from above. But then came the moment he had been waiting for. The factory's general manager announced loudly, "Our CEO will be visiting today. Everyone, make sure this place looks perfect." Gasps rippled through the workers. The CEO himself here? Richard's chest swelled with pride. He brushed his jacket, straightened his tie, and whispered to those nearby, "Watch how he'll notice me. He knows I run this floor better than anyone." The others nodded nervously, preparing for the arrival of a man they all expected to be dressed in elegance, surrounded by security, exuding power. But when the doors finally opened, silence fell over the factory. No entourage walked in. No suited figure appeared. Instead, the man they had ridiculed, insulted, and dismissed as worthless walked slowly to the center of the floor. His hands were rough, his clothes simple, but his eyes held a fire none of them had seen before. Workers exchanged confused glances. Richard scoffed loudly. "What is this? Did they send a janitor instead of the boss?" His laughter echoed in the uneasy silence. The undercover CEO straightened his back and looked around at every face. Then, with a calm but commanding voice, he spoke. "For weeks, I have worked beside you. I have carried the boxes, cleaned the floors, and endured your words. You thought I was nothing, but the truth is I own everything you see here. I am the CEO of this company." The factory froze. For a moment, not even the machines dared to move. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and breaths caught in throats. The disbelief was overwhelming. Some shook their heads, convinced it was a joke. Others felt the blood drain from their faces as they remembered every word, every insult, every laugh they had thrown his way. Richard's face turned pale, then red, then pale again. He forced a laugh, stumbling over his words. "You expect us to believe that? You, the broke worker? Impossible." The CEO's calm expression never wavered. With a nod, one of the regional managers stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "It's true. This man is the founder and CEO of the company. He came here in disguise to see how you truly behave when no one is watching." A collective gasp swept the room. Murmurs filled the air, disbelief melting into shame, awe, and fear. The workers who had ignored him lowered their eyes. Those who mocked him felt their stomachs twist with regret. And those who had shown kindness, few as they were, stood taller, their eyes meeting his with pride and relief. The CEO's gaze scanned the floor until it landed on Richard. The supervisor's arrogance had drained away completely, replaced by trembling desperation. He stuttered, "Sir, I didn't know if I had known." The CEO cut him off with a raised hand. "That is exactly the point. You didn't know, and yet you chose cruelty. You chose to mock, to belittle, to abuse those who trusted you for guidance. Leadership is not about fear. It is about respect. Today, your choices have caught up with you." Richard's knees nearly buckled. His voice shook. "Please, I was only trying to keep order." The CEO's voice grew colder, sharper. "You kept order through humiliation. You built obedience through fear. That is not leadership, it is failure." He turned to the managers. "Effective immediately, Richard is dismissed from this company." A heavy silence fell. Workers exchanged stunned looks. Some felt a secret satisfaction at seeing the tyrant fall, while others still stared in disbelief at the man who only yesterday carried boxes like them, now speaking with the authority of a king. But the CEO wasn't finished. His eyes softened as he turned toward the young woman who had once offered him her sandwich. "And you," he said gently, "showed kindness when there was no reason to. You treated me with dignity when others treated me as nothing. From today, you will not remain in the shadows. I and promoting you to a supervisory role." Her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined such recognition, especially not for something as simple as an act of kindness. The factory floor erupted in whispers, many glancing at her with a new sense of respect. Then the CEO faced the older man who had quietly shared the burden of the heavy box. "And you," he continued, "your silence spoke louder than words. You didn't boast, you didn't hesitate. You simply helped. That is true leadership. You will join the management team." The older man bowed his head humbly, his weathered face breaking into the faintest smile. The rest of the workers stood frozen, hearts pounding with shame, regret, or newfound respect. The CEO looked around the room one last time, his voice firm, yet filled with emotion. This company was built on values: respect, integrity, dignity. But somewhere along the way, those values were lost. "I came here not to punish, but to remind you. How you treat those you believe powerless reveals who you truly are. Remember this day, because I will never forget what I saw." With those words, he turned and walked toward the exit. The factory remained in stunned silence, every worker replaying their own actions in their minds. Some hung their heads in shame, realizing how easily they had failed the test. Others felt pride that they had stood on the side of kindness. And all of them knew, from that moment forward, things would never be the same. For the man they thought was broke had revealed himself as their CEO. And in doing so, he had forever changed the meaning of power, respect, and dignity within those walls.